What if I told you the 1950s gave us war films that weren't just patriotic fluff, but raw daring and decades ahead of their time? These weren't the movies that made it into school textbooks. They were the ones that rattled censors, unnerved politicians, and left veterans quietly nodding in approval. Forgotten by most, yet unforgettable once rediscovered, these are the war stories that still pack a punch. Let's dive in. Fixed Bayonets, 1951. The Korean War rarely got the big screen spotlight in its own era, but Samuel Fuller's Fixed Bayonets changed that with a survival tale, as icy as the mountains it depicts. Instead of focusing on generals or grand strategy, Fuller zoomed in on a single platoon ordered to stay behind during a retreat, effectively sacrificing themselves so the rest of the unit could escape. That premise alone makes the stakes unbearably tense. Shot on a shoestring budget of less than $1 million, Fuller pulled off miracles with ingenuity. He covered sound stages in crushed marble to mimic snow, and relied on clever blocking to simulate large-scale battle without an army of extras. Even the lead actor Gene Evans wasn't a Hollywood star at all. He was a real soldier. Fuller had handpicked because he wanted authentic body language, not polished theatrics. The dialogue went further than most studios were comfortable with at the time. Soldiers openly talked about fear, cold, and death, which risked violating Hollywood's production code. Fuller had to tone it down, but the grit still seeped through. Veterans praised it for showing rearguard duty not as glamorous heroics, but as a psychological trial of endurance. The U.S. Army even borrowed clips of it not for tactical training, but to prepare recruits for the mental strain of retreat missions. Forgotten by audiences, Fixed Bayonets deserves a revival as one of the most honest portrayals of the Korean War ever made. It isn't about victory parades. It's about survival, when winning isn't even an option. Retreat Hell, 1952. With a title like Retreat Hell, you'd expect another gung-ho flag waver. But this movie, based on the legendary breakout from the Chosan Reservoir during the Korean War, told a far more sobering story. At its core, it's about the brutal reality of being cut off, surrounded, and forced to fight your way through sub-zero conditions just to survive. The story follows U.S. Marines under Colonel John Stevens, played by Frank Lovejoy, as they endure freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and relentless enemy pressure. Unlike typical Hollywood war dramas of the day, this one leaned into the misery of the campaign. Soldiers weren't indestructible. They were weary, frostbitten, and desperate. For many in the audience, it was the first time they'd seen the Korean conflict depicted with anything resembling authenticity. What makes it stand out today is its balance of toughness and vulnerability. It didn't sanitize the ordeal, but it also didn't completely strip away camaraderie or flashes of humor. The result is a rare snapshot of the Korean War that refuses to glamorize suffering while still honoring the grit of the Marines who endured it. Audiences at the time weren't sure what to make of it. Some critics thought it leaned too heavily into the bleak, while veterans nodded knowingly. That disconnect may explain why it faded from memory, but watch it now, and it feels decades ahead of its time. Gritty realism before gritty realism was fashionable. It's the kind of war film that doesn't scream for attention, but leaves a chill that lingers long after the credits roll. 1 Minute to Zero, 1952. Robert Mitchum was at the height of his tough guy charisma when he starred in 1 Minute to Zero, another overlooked Korean War picture that blended spectacle with intimate drama. The film starts with the chaos of a sudden North Korean offensive, but quickly pivots to show the human toll of civilians caught in the crossfire. That shift alone made it controversial. Hollywood wasn't supposed to dwell on civilians, only soldiers. Mitchum plays Colonel Steve Janowski, tasked with both defending a collapsing front and orchestrating an evacuation. Along the way, he falls for Linda Darnell's war widow character, whose perspective grounds the film in emotional stakes rather than just battlefield strategy. What sets the movie apart is its willingness to pause for scenes of refugees on the move, children displaced, and the impossible choices officers had to make in moments of desperation. The production had help from the Pentagon, so it came stocked with tanks, artillery, and explosions galore. But despite the spectacle, it was the quieter, darker moments that stuck with those who saw it. A particular sequence still debated today depicted U.S. forces shelling areas where civilians were believed to be hiding. It shocked audiences in the 1950s, not because of gore, but because it suggested moral ambiguity where viewers were used to clean-cut heroics. Critics dismissed it as uneven torn between romance and war film. Yet in hindsight, that tension is exactly what makes 1 Minute to Zero unique. It tried, however awkwardly, to capture the impossible dilemmas of war, rather than the victory parades. That risk is why it deserves to be remembered. The Desert Rats, 1953. Richard Burton may have been barely in his late 20s, but in The Desert Rats he radiates the weary toughness of a veteran twice his age. This film throws us into the siege of Tobruk, where a ragtag band of mostly Australian troops held off Rommel's seemingly unstoppable Afrika Korps. On paper, it sounds like yet another Allied triumph tale. In execution, it's far grittier, messier, and more personal. Burton plays Captain Tammy McRoberts, a strict but secretly compassionate leader tasked with turning undisciplined soldiers into a fighting force. Alongside him is James Mason returning to play Rommel after the Desert Fox. Mason gives the German general both charisma and menace, reminding viewers that war wasn't fought against faceless stereotypes. The production went big. Large-scale desert battles, realistic sets, and strong attention to detail in military equipment. But the real triumph was its focus on character. The film examined the strain on men thrown into impossible circumstances, how fear translated into discipline, and how camaraderie had to be earned rather than assumed. Burton himself called it one of his proudest performances long before Cleopatra made him a global celebrity. At the time, some critics thought the movie was too Australian to sell globally, while others saw it as overshadowed by The Desert Fox. But watch it today, and The Desert Rats feels like a breath of fresh air, gritty, character-driven, and respectful, of the ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things. It's a war film that remembers the men, not just the medals. They Who Dare, 1954. Not all forgotten war films went big. Some kept it lean and daring. They Who Dare, directed by Louis Milestone and starring Dirk Bogarde, takes the classic commando raid setup and injects it with taut suspense. The mission? A small British unit sneaks into the Greek islands to sabotage German airfields. Simple on paper, nerve-shredding in execution. Bogarde, better known for refined roles, throws himself into the mud and sweat here. His portrayal of Lieutenant Graham captures both determination and vulnerability, making the audience feel every setback and flicker of hope. Unlike the larger epics of the time, They Who Dare doesn't lean on massive set pieces. Instead, it builds tension from claustrophobic landscapes, sudden ambushes, and the constant awareness that failure means annihilation. What really stands out is the use of on-location shooting in Cyprus, which gave the film a striking realism. Harsh sun, rocky terrain, and authentic villages provided a gritty backdrop that no studio lot could replicate. The supporting cast, including Denholm Elliott in an early role, add flavor to the ensemble, giving each soldier a distinct personality. Critics didn't fall in love with it. They saw it as a modest, even routine war movie. But that undersells its achievement. By avoiding melodrama and instead showing the nerves, sweat, and tension of sabotage missions, They Who Dare feels far more authentic than its reputation suggests. Today it deserves a spot alongside the great commando stories not lost in the archives, Hell and High Water. In 1954, when you hear Cold War thriller, your mind probably jumps to the 60s. But Samuel Fuller beat everyone to it in Hell and High Water. Unlike his grittier battlefield films, this one takes the action underwater, on board a nuclear submarine, chasing down whispers of an atomic plot. The premise alone was bold for 1954. A French scientist fears communists are planning a nuclear attack, and an American ex-subcommander is hired to stop it. Richard Widmark leads the cast as Captain Adam Jones, a tough-as-nails sailor who knows his sub like an extension of his body. Genevieve Page adds an international flair as the French scientist, giving the movie an unexpected romantic thread. While the setup sounds pulp, Fuller's execution is anything but. He stages tight claustrophobic sequences that make you feel every creak of the submarine's hull and every drop of sweat as depth charges explode nearby. What makes it fascinating today is how unapologetically political it was. Rather than simple East versus West rhetoric, Fuller played with the paranoia of the time, questioning trust alliances, and the very sanity of nuclear brinkmanship. The U.S. Navy didn't lend support, so Fuller leaned on studio ingenuity using miniature subs, careful lighting, and clever sound design to create intensity. At release, some critics brushed it off as over the top, but looking back, it was a rare blend of war film, espionage, drama, and science fiction anxiety. It foreshadowed the wave of Cold War thrillers that dominated the next 2 decades. Hell and High Water proves that even in 1954, Fuller was already years ahead of the curve. The Steel Helmet, 1951. If you want a war film that doesn't pull punches, Samuel Fuller's The Steel Helmet, is it? Shot in less than 2 weeks on a microscopic budget, this Korean War story is gritty, unpolished, and absolutely electrifying. It begins with a lone survivor, Sergeant Zach, played by Gene Evans, dragged from a battlefield with a bullet hole in his helmet and a chip on his shoulder. From there, he links up with a ragtag group of soldiers hiding in a Buddhist temple. What unfolds isn't a neat tale of bravery, but a raw portrait of men under pressure. The dialogue dives straight into topics most films of the era wouldn't touch: race loyalty and the futility of war. One character, a black medic, faces discrimination even from his own side. Another, a young Korean boy nicknamed Short Round, highlights the human cost of conflict in ways audiences weren't prepared for. Fuller himself had fought in World War II, and you can feel it in every frame. He didn't sanitize war, he made it feel chaotic, ugly, and unpredictable. The Pentagon refused to support the film, which forced Fuller to improvise with cheap sets and leftover props. Yet, that only made the movie grittier. Veterans hailed it as one of the few films that actually captured the randomness of combat. Censors tried to tone it down, but The Steel Helmet slipped through and became a sleeper hit. Today it's not just forgotten, it's revolutionary. Fuller gave America its first real Korean War film, and it still stings with truth. Men in War, 1957. Anthony Mann, best known for his westerns, dipped into war cinema just once and delivered a masterpiece. Men in War strips away the grandeur of victory to focus on the exhaustion of survival. Set. During the Korean War, the film follows Lieutenant Benson, played by Robert Ryan, as he tries to shepherd a small group of men to safety at Hill 465. Alongside him is Aldo Ray's Sergeant Montana, a hot-headed soldier who trusts instinct over authority. What makes it unforgettable is the tension between those two men. Their clash of personalities becomes as dangerous as the unseen enemy surrounding them. Mann uses silenced landscape and tight close-ups to show just how frayed nerves can get in the middle of nowhere. Instead of wave after wave of battles, we get uncertainty, paranoia, and the constant question, who will crack first? At the time, critics didn't know how to handle it. The lack of rah-rah speeches or patriotic resolutions confused audiences used to neat endings. Yet, filmmakers noticed. Decades later, Terrence Malick cited Men in War as a major influence on the Thin Red Line. You can see why it's less about winning a war and more about surviving your own mind in one. For years, the film was nearly impossible to find, circulating only in poor prints. But once restored, its power was undeniable. Men in War stands today as proof that sometimes the quietest war films cut the deepest. Battle Hymn, 1957. On the surface, Battle Hymn looks like a straightforward hero pilot story. Rock Hudson plays Colonel Dean Hess, a real-life fighter pilot who led missions during the Korean War. But what makes the film striking isn't the dogfights, it's the inner battle of a man torn between past and present. The film opens with Hess haunted by his earlier mistakes as a World War II pilot, where his decisions led to civilian casualties. Determined to redeem himself, he throws everything into leading a squadron of American and South Korean pilots. Along the way, he becomes deeply involved in protecting Korean orphans displaced by the war, giving the film its emotional core. Unlike many war dramas of the 1950s, Battle Hymn didn't shy away from the personal costs of leadership. Hudson, often cast in romantic or glamorous roles, brought surprising weight to the part. He played Hess as a man burdened by guilt, but still driven by duty. The movie swings between thrilling aerial scenes and intimate, heart-wrenching moments, creating a balance that few films of the era attempted. Critics were split. Some accused it of sentimentality, while others praised its unusual humanity. But for modern viewers, the sentiment is exactly what makes it memorable. It's not a film about glory and combat. It's about carrying guilt and trying against impossible odds to set something right. That alone makes Battle Hymn stand apart in a decade full of forgettable aerial adventures. Time limit, 1957. Courtroom drama meets war film in Time. Limit a bold movie that tackled a taboo subject head-on. Collaboration under captivity. Instead of battlefields, the film takes place in a military courtroom where an officer played by Richard Widmark investigates charges against another officer accused of aiding the enemy while imprisoned during the Korean War. From the first scene, it's clear this isn't going to be a simple trial. The accused, played by Richard Basehart, insists he only cooperated to save the lives of fellow prisoners. The prosecution calls him a traitor. The defense argues he acted out of humanity. What results is a razor-sharp debate about morality, survival, and the impossible choices made in the darkest conditions. What's remarkable is that this was the only film directed by Karl Malden, better known as an Oscar-winning actor. He brought a sharp sense of character detail to every exchange. Instead of flashy combat scenes, the drama is entirely verbal, but just as tense as any firefight. At the time, audiences weren't ready for the subject matter. The idea that an American soldier might break under pressure was almost unthinkable. The film wasn't a commercial hit, but it quietly set the stage for later explorations of the moral fog of war. Today, Time Limit feels ahead of its time. It doesn't offer easy answers. It dares you to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. That's the mark of a war movie that still matters. Ice Cold and Alex, 1958. If you're craving a war movie that feels more like a survival thriller than a battlefield epic, Ice Cold and Alex is the one. This British classic follows a small group of soldiers and a nurse trekking across the scorching North African desert, trying to reach Alexandria during World War II. Their ambulance, nicknamed Katie, becomes both their lifeline and their coffin on wheels. John Mills plays Captain Anson, a man unraveling under heat fatigue and creeping alcoholism. His companions, including Sylvia Sims as the nurse, must keep the group moving while navigating mine's quicksand and the suspicion that one of them may not be who he claims. The tension builds not from firefights, but from sand thirst and paranoia. The authenticity is breathtaking. Director J. Lee Thompson shot on location in Libya, using blistering desert landscapes that feel less like a backdrop and more like an enemy itself. Every moment, whether digging out a stuck vehicle or rationing the last drops of water, feels unbearably real. And then there's the legendary ending. A weary Captain Anson downing a frosty beer in Alexandria, a moment so iconic it actually inspired one of Britain's most famous beer commercials decades later. Forgotten in the States, but treasured in the UK, Ice Cold and Alex is one of those rare war films that strips away the uniforms and medals and focuses on endurance, trust, and sheer will to live. It's proof that sometimes the greatest battles happen far away from the front lines. The Silent Enemy, 1958. Before James Bond glamorized underwater missions, The Silent Enemy took audiences beneath the surface for real tension. Based on actual events, this British film tells the story of Lieutenant Lionel Buster Crabbe, a naval officer tasked with stopping Italian divers who were sinking Allied ships in the Mediterranean. It's less about gunfire and more about ingenuity, stealth, and nerves of steel. Lawrence Harvey leads the cast, bringing quiet intensity to Crabbe. Unlike the swashbuckling heroes of the era, Harvey plays him as practical, methodical, and human. The real star, though, is the underwater cinematography. Using groundbreaking techniques for the time, director William Fairchild staged sequences that capture divers silently planting explosives under ships or battling one another in eerie, murky silence. The film also refuses to paint things in black and white. The Italian divers are portrayed with surprising respect, emphasizing skill and discipline rather than villainy. That nuance made it stand out in a decade when most war films leaned on cliches. Critics admired its realism, but the movie didn't achieve blockbuster status. Over time, it faded into obscurity, overshadowed by bigger, flashier productions. But in hindsight, it feels like a trailblazer, an early blueprint for every underwater espionage thriller that came later. Watch it now, and you'll see where half of Hollywood's underwater suspense tropes were born. Pork Chop Hill, 1959. Gregory Peck was already a household name when he signed on for Pork Chop Hill, a Korean War drama that stripped away Hollywood gloss in favor of bleak realism. The film recreates one of the war's most grueling battles, where U.S. soldiers fought desperately to hold a strategically minor hill, while peace talks dragged on in the background. The brilliance of Pork Chop Hill lies in its irony. Men die by the dozens for a patch of ground that even commanders admit has little value. Peck's Lieutenant Joe Clemens knows the futility, but has no choice. Orders are orders. That tension between duty and absurdity drives the narrative and gives the film its haunting edge. Director Lewis Milestone, who had earlier helmed All Quiet on the Western Front, brings the same unflinching eye for chaos and confusion. Smoke, mud, exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of reinforcements that never arrive. It's all here. The film also introduced future stars like Woody Strode and George Peppard in supporting roles, adding to its legacy. When released, audiences didn't quite know how to process it. Too grim to be rousing, too recent to be nostalgic, it occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. But that's exactly why it resonates now. Porkchop Hill isn't about glory. It's about the futility of sacrifice when politics and human lives collide. The Hunters, 1958. For sheer spectacle, The Hunters takes the crown. Robert Mitchum returned to the war genre this time as a seasoned fighter pilot during the Korean War. Paired with Robert Wagner as a cocky young ace, the film explores not only dogfights in the sky, but also the rivalries and personal struggles that define life in the cockpit. What sets The Hunters apart are the aerial sequences. Using actual U.S. Air Force jets and innovative aerial photography, the film captured dogfights with a realism audiences hadn't seen before. Planes dart, stall, and roar through cloud banks in ways that still feel impressive today. It's one of those rare war films where the action genuinely takes your breath away. Yet the drama doesn't stop in the skies. Mitchum's character, Major Cleve Saville, wrestles with age relevance and a forbidden romance that complicates his loyalty to his fellow pilots. Meanwhile, Wagner's reckless Lieutenant Pell embodies the dangers of arrogance in a world where mistakes mean lives lost. Their clashing philosophies create as much turbulence as the enemy. At the time, some dismissed it as glossy melodrama, but modern eyes can see the blend of action and emotion for what it is. An ambitious attempt to humanize pilots without softening the intensity of their missions. The Hunters may have been overshadowed by later Vietnam-era films, but it remains a dazzling, underrated gem of the 1950s. Yesterday's Enemy, 1959. The British film, Yesterday's Enemy, closes our list with a gut punch. Set in the Burmese jungle, it focuses on a small group of soldiers cut off from their unit, forced to make brutal decisions just to survive. Unlike most war movies of the time, it doesn't celebrate gallantry, it questions morality. Stanley Baker stars as Captain Langford, a commander who orders the execution of prisoners in order to gain crucial intelligence. The act shocks his men, divides the group, and sets up a story where survival comes at the expense of conscience. There's no easy redemption here, only a gnawing sense that war corrodes the very ideals it's supposed to defend. Director Val Guest, known mostly for thrillers, shot the film with stripped-down intensity. Jungle settings become claustrophobic traps, the atmosphere damp and suffocating. Instead of flashy battle scenes, the suspense comes from debates, accusations, and the creeping realization that everyone is compromised. When released, audiences weren't ready for its bleak honesty. Some critics accused it of being unpatriotic, while others praised it for daring to show soldiers as flawed, conflicted human beings. It didn't make a splash at the box office, but its reputation has grown over the years among war film enthusiasts. In many ways, Yesterday's Enemy anticipated the moral ambiguity of later Vietnam-era cinema. It asked, what does victory mean if it costs your soul? That question makes it one of the boldest, most unforgettable war films of its decade. So, there you have it, 15 forgotten war films from the 1950s that proved the decade wasn't all about glossy propaganda. Some were gritty, some daring, others heartbreakingly human. But each dared to tell stories Hollywood now barely remembers. Which of these hidden gems surprised you most? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more cinematic deep dives, and share this with someone who loves lost film history. The rediscovery starts here.